Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The End Result of Weak IT Hygiene. We're pleased you could join us for an in-depth discussion on the changing landscape of cybersecurity and how two industry leaders are shifting their entire approach by enforcing high standards of zero trust protection. My name is Megan Billingsley from CIO Dive's Brand Studio, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. With us today are Danny Jenkins, CEO of ThreatLocker, and a technical guru with a deep understanding of corporate IT and cybersecurity. Also, Tim Rohrbaugh, CISO at JetBlue, and a technical leader with extremely broad experience in the information security space. Danny and Tim, it's wonderful to have you both with us today. Can I start off just by asking, how have security programs been challenged under COVID?
Well, thank you for having us, Megan, and Tim, thank you for joining us again. And we represent a large scope of organizations, very heavily in the managed IT provider side, which looks after businesses from small to large. And as the last few months have evolved, we've seen acceptance of risk go up, threats go up, and the number of penetration points go up from the outside as well. So whereas 3 or 4 months ago, everybody was sitting safely in their office behind their corporate firewall, there was a handful of users that maybe worked remotely, but most people were protected by their firewall. Applications like Zoom and Teams were being used far less. And now we're seeing all of these added into the equation as new ways for threats to enter the business. And unfortunately, this is resulting in not just one pandemic, but a second pandemic of ransomware increasing. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint of criminality as it relates to economy, typically it's inversely proportional, right? Economy goes into troubled areas, revenue drops, but criminality goes up. So as we're all challenged with revenues dropping, then all of a sudden we have constraints on spend and staff and labor. But in security, obviously our workload doesn't change. In fact, it typically increases. Then there's obviously the next side of it, and that is that under this condition of COVID or this event, we've had a lot of remote workers. And like Danny was saying, it changes the way that we protect the end users from themselves and from obviously outside attack. So then businesses have to change their risk assessments. Where are we going to spend security investments? Where are we going to get the most out of risk reduction? Where are we going to get the most visibility into anomalous activities? All of those things have had to change. And then obviously it depends on what sector you're in. You have different constraints with respect to revenue and spend that are sometimes dramatic.
One of the things we've seen an awful lot of, and I'm wondering, Tim, have you seen similar experiences? Is the use of tools like Zoom, like Teams, are increasing massively, but also the understanding of what the norm is changing, and there's been an ongoing issue. If we take something like spear phishing, where it's common practice to see emails from the CEO to someone in the accounts payable department asking them to pay invoices that are spoofed, and that's not unusual. But and sometimes people fall for it, and sometimes they don't fall for these scams. But when you see in an office environment where everybody's used to seeing each other, they say, well, I never get emails like this asking me to pay things. That's not common. And they're sitting across the office and they can speak to the CEO or the CFO or yourself and say, Tim, what's this invoice? Now that we're seeing people remote, if they receive an email from what they appear to be the CISO asking them to pay a bill, then that person, they reply back to that email, which is a fake address or a compromised address. Mm-hmm. They're now engaging in this. And the norm is definitely changing for what is normal. And when we have, even in small businesses, and like I said, we work a lot with managed service providers, and they represent a lot of small businesses where there's 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 people in an office. It's very hard for these guys to understand where the threats are. But when you're representing tens of thousands of users and suddenly essentially tens of thousands of exposure points in your organization, how do you address that? How do you think about dealing with all of these people suddenly not knowing what is normal and using this whole bunch of new tools?
I'm going to say something, kind of snide, but from the standpoint of the way that everybody's looking at criminality, the funny thing is that as businesses and enterprises are challenged, so are criminals. And criminality as a business has models that change also. And I think they're challenged to figure out how to take advantage of us. And the things that they were doing before that they were monetizing aren't as effective today. Phishing is still effective, but with respect to where they're installing malware, for instance, if they install it on an end user's desktop that's now remote, it's less likely they're going to be able to convert it into ransomware in the back-end systems because they're not getting the same privileges as if they were on site. So there's challenges on both sides, criminality as a business and true legitimate business. So so what areas have become more likely to be taken advantage of? And you brought up something, is phishing more successful as a technique by criminals than it was when people were co-located together? I don't know. The premise of it sounds very interesting. I'm not sure if it's borne out that way, but I can see what you're saying for sure. Phishing has definitely picked up, and they're just using other types of marketing campaigns, COVID, and other types of government subsidy terms to try to get people to click. There's also a change to ransomware, as you've seen. Ransomware started out as an attack which was looking to monetize, an end user's device. Then they were catching enterprises, but they were still keeping the ransom at the same amount. And now what you're seeing is ransoms are not telling you how much the ransom is going to be until they do an investigation on whose computer it got on, what the enterprise makes, possibly if there's any information about recent funding. All of this is coming through as evidenced by some of the law enforcement agencies.
Actually, we just saw Garmin just yesterday or the day before agree to pay a $10 million ransom, which is, I've seen a lot of ransoms and pretty common in the area of $20 to $1 million, but this is definitely the first I've seen at $10 million. And you've got to imagine being the CISO of a company like that and making a decision to pay a $10 million check on a coin's toss chance you're going to get your data back. I mean, that's going to be a scary corner to be in.
I hate to knock people while they're down, but I am. If anybody knows my background, last 15 years I've been in triathlons and duathlons, and for many of us, we wake up in the morning, we decide how our day has been at the end of the day by looking at our Garmin data. I mean, it tracks everything from health to breath to respiration, stress level. So it's funny that you bring that one up. It's been a point of contention for many of us in of the triathlon community that it's been down, and it's been kind of a shock. I can't believe I didn't see that they were going to pay a $10 million ransom, but in a sense, that almost sounds like a deal to me.
Yeah. Well,
obviously.
It's not so much as a good deal. It's you've got no choice. But I've been on the other side of this as well, where we see companies pay ransoms, never $10 million, and they don't get their data back, or they get the decryption keys in such a useless state that it takes them another 12 months to actually get everything decrypted, and they have to go through each machine and each file, and it fails, and it's got to be a bad situation. And from that, I mean,
horrendous.
And we one of the biggest things people are scared of is ransomware. The idea that someone's going to take your data and you can't even access your own data is terrifying. But what's just as terrifying, if someone's able to get access to your files to encrypt them at a point, and I don't know every detail of what they got access to in Garmin, but clearly it was enough, but a point where they can access your data to encrypt them, and the file where you're going to pay $10 million, that means they can get that data and they can copy it and they can take that data. And I don't care if someone sees my run rate. It's going to be to the refrigerator and back 3 times. But but I imagine that some of that is considered sensitive data.
Well, the thing is, Danny, I mean, if you look and they've been running ransomware. Most ransomware, by and large, has been a legal practice that has been run as almost like a legitimate business, and they're worried about customer experience. I know that sounds funny, but if you look at a lot of the data, when you ask for a proof of life, you get a real file off the system. When you pay for a key, you get it decrypted. The problem is, and the question in your mind that you brought up is, did they take any of that data? When they get into the enterprise level, there's no way they can take the data. It's just too large, too massive, and too complex to find out what's really of value. And it would trigger all kinds of egress alarms with respect to the volume of data that would be transferred out. So I don't think that they structure it like that because there's too many ways that it would break. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, especially on the individual level. But here's the thing we go back to, right? And we'll circle hopefully back to the title of this around IT hygiene. You've got the instantiation of malicious software inside the environment. So first it has to get downloaded, then it has to get instantiated, and then it has to phone home to get any kind of instructions or to give feedback on what it's done. And we have opportunities to break it at all of those points. And the question is, having users remote now because of COVID, or maybe if there has been a drop off in IT hygiene, or validation of your existing controls, the operation side of security, have we done what we need to do to make it less likely that ransomware is going to happen? And there are definitely opportunities to break their business model.
So since IT hygiene was mentioned, then let me just jump in. We do have a question. How does the state of IT systems, including technical debt, change security risk?
Yeah, well, I'll jump on that one because it's near and dear to my heart. We create a security. We have to have a partnership with IT. Even if we're inside of a reporting structure inside of IT, there has to be a relationship that creates some amount of tension between the production of new products, features, operational change, and security. And security usually means taking longer or putting controls in place that make things a little more difficult to do, because we're trying to put speed bumps in for criminality. So hygiene is one of those things that requires a little bit of extra time on a project, right? You've got to clean up systems and domains and IP addresses and things from prior versions that are being replaced as part of this. Code needs to be removed. There's just all kinds of things that are maintenance activities. And when you have a reduction in support labor, you tend to have a drop off in IT hygiene. And when you move very quickly, hygiene also sacrifices. And so all that ends up being is additional surface area for criminalities to attack.
Yeah, talking about that, I mean, you mentioned obviously it's much harder to be effective when somebody's working from home and they open an email attachment and they get ransomware on their computer, taking VPNs out of the equation. Where we've seen horrendous amounts of increase in ransomware is organizations opening up more remote access to their network. At the worst level, opening things like RDP ports to file servers or terminal servers of some description where people can RDP in, but even through VPNs or RDP gateways or other things like that. And whereas before, even if companies had remote access through an RDP gateway or Citrix server of some description, they were limited to maybe 5% of the organization or 10% of the organization. So if you're thinking as a big enterprise, you've got to go after those 10%. And quite often they were more tech savvy users. They were users who were used to seeing phishing emails. They were traveling. The senior sales people or tech people that are used to. I'm not stupid enough to click on a link to enter my password. But what we've seen happened over the last 3 or 4 months is everybody evolved from that to someone in accounts payable who's never left the office in their life, or someone who answers phones at the front desk, suddenly connecting to their business environment using a remote access tool like remote desktop. And now we're actually getting further inside the perimeter, because now we have 100% of people or 90% of people with weak passwords, with potentially the bypass of dual factor authentication, because you may have dual factor authentication normally and someone's made a quick bypass because we can't get everyone dual factor devices or Duo installed on their phone in the next 15 minutes.
Yeah. No, you actually brought up a point, and that is that I think almost everybody who watches this and who has experienced this will agree is that you had a certain amount of assumptions, or actually you had a certain amount of risk that you've identified, and they are things that you've assumed that are not in compliance with policy, right, in the past. And those exceptions were known, and they probably were tracking on a certain trajectory. But once COVID came in, all of a sudden, people have submitted for exceptions from IT policies, which you counted on before. And so they've just grown and they've grown and they've grown. And it's just to keep people working, keep business functioning in a change of where the labor is at. And so how have we kept track of all of those? And when do we reverse out of that, right? Have we changed, password change policies? Have we changed controls around the end devices so that we could allow for them to function at home, because we didn't have a way to get them to internal resources, not all at the same time. All of those exceptions is part of IT hygiene. It needs to be cleaned up after this, or we need to change our security controls and our monitoring based on this happening. That's why I look for the areas where I'm going to get the highest level of assurance, or let's say confidence, that a tool is going to solve a problem, right? Is going to reduce risk.
And it's interesting you mentioned that. So we're seeing, and in ThreatLocker, we're having a great experience in that we're seeing more and more people turn to endpoint tools that install on the endpoint, because the perimeter is essentially disappearing. Yeah, and it has been for some time now, but that progress has been sped up at a much faster rate because of COVID. When you're seeing people, when you're choosing new tools, there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of antivirus and EDR out there that's going on the detection. Are you thinking about better detection, or are you thinking about more policy and control?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I tell people all the time, as a security professional, we only have two responsibilities. Everything we do has to sort into, generally, by and large, two drivers. One is risk reduction, so reduce the probability of an event occurring, a breach event. That is a control. And the other is reduce the consequence when one occurs. And that is time to detect, right? Or things like data minimization. So if I can find a tool that achieves gain on both sides at the same time, that's a value. So control and visibility are kind of a dual benefit. It doesn't always sort like that, but sometimes it does. And then with respect to kind of a change in the environment and how looking at endpoint security, endpoint for the longest time, when talking about security, we've not been very specific with it, but it's been around detection, right? Everything's been around detection, and detection of anomalies is hard. Detection of malware and all of that is difficult because it changes all the time. And it seems like we've been doing this for so long and making very little progress. And I think there's an opportunity to come at it a different way, and that's kind of how I got introduced to you.
Well, and that's it. I mean, I remember, and we mentioned the nice pull between the IT and security. So I worked for a large corporation back in 2005, 2004, 3. It's a long time ago. And back in those days, getting malware was an inconvenience to the business. We weren't talking about encrypted files or data being copied off our network. We were talking about, someone's got pop-ups of on their computer of Viagra promoting drugs or something like that. And it was a whole different time. And back then it was, we can never beat this malware. It's a pain. And I remember changing our antivirus as our antivirus. And we approached it back then in certain areas, and it was very isolated to what's often referred to as application whitelisting. So instead of trying to look for malware, you just block everything that isn't trusted. And it was a headache. I mean, it was a big headache back in 2005 when apps didn't update every time you turn on your computer, and you could open Zoom without having an update every day. And when we came around, when ThreatLocker came around, the idea was we try and resolve that headache, and we create a policy. We allow you to create policies of what can run rather than looking for what's bad. And then beyond that, to control what happens once an application can run. Because one of the other things we often see, and you mentioned stopping damage once something's in the network. And again, detection is important on that, but also controls inside. So I mean, whether we call it microsegmentation or whether we call it ring fencing, where you're saying applications that are in your network, how can they move around, and what is the use of them? I mean, one of the big things the world's seeing at the moment is often referred to as fileless malware, but it's essentially the weaponization of your own tools. So taking something like Zoom or Internet Explorer and then calling out PowerShell, and then you don't even need to run malware on someone's machine.
Yeah, and so real quick, you hit on a couple points there, and I want to just go back to them. Number one is that if there is a change in what we consider the perimeter, right, the defense, and the amount of assurance that we got by actually enabling ingress, egress controls, has that changed today just because of remote workers? It has. So where has the perimeter moved to, if we still have one? Well, it's moved to the end devices, right? I mean, you might have split tunneling where it's communicating on two different networks at the same time, internal and external, or you might not. But regardless, at some point it's going to be off, and you've extended it out there. So do we have to change? I mean, is there an advantage to change from detection of anomalies and anomalous behavior and then try to do something about it, to versus the way that you're going about it, which is, isn't it time just to move to an absolute requirement around only applications running that you authorize? And I think that shift should be made now. I see the value in it. The other is that after you make that and you limit it down just to the applications that should run, that are necessary for business, can those be misused? They can. And so I think, from the standpoint of how, the concept of ring fencing or what an application can do on that authorized computer is fascinating and obviously powerful. Where I also find value is getting insights into, the movement of files and, the manipulation of files, and attributing that back not just to a user but to an application. That provides a lot of value with respect to forensics, from my standpoint.
Well, and we've seen that a lot, because more and more people are turning to, because when you're inside the perimeter, you can have file logging on your file server. It doesn't necessarily give you everything, but you can put logging and say who accessed this file. It doesn't tell you what they did with it on their endpoint. So it doesn't tell you if they plugged into a USB drive and they copied it onto a disk, or if they opened it with a web browser and uploaded it to the web. I mean, maybe on your web filtering, but again, the perimeter's kind of gone. So if somebody downloads a file onto their computer while they're connected to the VPN, and then they decide to upload it later on, you've lost visibility with that. So one of the things we're seeing a lot of people take use of is our file monitoring, where you can not only see who's accessing things on your server side, but also what they're doing with those files once they're on your endpoint. So if you've got somebody who copies something to a USB drive, they can say, someone copied this customer list down to their computer, they saved it in their documents folder, and then they accessed it with Google Chrome, or even worse, if someone takes something like and it's not ring fence like PowerShell. They uploaded it to the internet using PowerShell, and you can track that what's happening there to say, oh, okay, this user did something, PowerShell ran, and all of our files were accessed by it, and they were posted onto this Google bucket in the cloud. And so you've got that visibility or control, in hopefully a control as well, that you don't just, it's great to view things, but you want to be able to stop it.
How do you think about achieving security program improvements?
You know, that is, I've tried a lot of different ways, been in security for a long time, and I don't know if any of you look at like self-improvement stuff and books, but, you know, Simon Sinek has, you know, Find Your Why. And I in the last couple of years have taken that back and internalized that and put it towards actually tasking around security and security improvement. And I figured from the standpoint of why we do things, wouldn't it be nice to have an answer to investment in security and investment in time? So in an essence, what I ended up with was coming up with, you can think of it like the triumvirate of why in security. It's threat actor, threat scenario, and target. That combination of those three elements together give a purpose for why we do things. And so from the standpoint of improvement, we can either choose to do like the old development waterfall, or we can move to agile. We can do the same thing with security improvement. We can do it at a project level, or we can do small incremental changes which have a net effect of being a large risk reduction. So from the standpoint of where I'm at today personally is the thought of using very specific drivers and you know, answers to why we're going to do certain actions, and then driving it in small incremental changes, something more akin to agile or Kaizen.
The more incremental changes you can do, the more success you have, because you're not always blocked by the next big action or a number of things to happen. One of the things, I mean, if I'm looking back, I mean, I remember back in the late 90s, mail servers were open relays. So every email server, every SMTP server could send email to anywhere, and that was absolutely fine. I mean, no one thought there was a problem with that until there was a problem with it. And by 2001, or probably 2001, that disappeared. No server was an open relay. We changed from we changed from wide open to list of blacklist people that send bad mail to closed. You can't send mail unless you're on our trusted list. In 2002, computers didn't run personal firewalls, or some did, but they were generally considered the more paranoid security people who would put personal firewalls on their computer. And then the Blaster virus came out and spread like wildfire over internet connections, and the dynamics changed. So now if you've got any PC or any Mac, you turn it on and there's a firewall on that PC, and all ports are blocked by default unless you turn it off. Inbound ports at least, and one day we'll see more outbound. And before that, again, we were just looking for bad stuff. Now, fast forward to now, this is where we're seeing the next big change, and I almost feel like it's so far overdue. Whereas 10 years ago, everyone was looking for bad stuff on their computer, and then they blocked it. Where do you see that? Do you see the whole world in 10 years' time using a default deny approach on applications?
No, I mean, I'm going to describe the change, a different change around the same period of time. So I won't date myself completely, but there was a period of time where you could log on a system and you would log on it, but you weren't actually attributing it to an individual user, right? We just had access, physical access or network access to a system, and it was shared, right? And at some point, wouldn't you say this paradigm shift to whitelisting users, right? We defined who the users were, what their roles were, what they should have access to. It was a logical shift to risk reduction and also attribution to usage. So why haven't we made that shift from the standpoint of applications? I have no idea. Right now, for many, it's about let all applications run, let everyone into your house, and we'll only take the keys away from people who steal things. That doesn't make any sense. It's better just to hand out the keys to the people who you trust, right? And so isn't that application whitelisting? I mean, isn't that what what we should be doing today, or at the point where, almost everything should be treated that way?
Yeah. And the technology is improving too. So, and it used to be a lot more difficult than it is today. And that's why I think we're seeing more and more people adopt that. But from an enterprise point of view, do you see an environment where 95% of your users should be installing new software without permissions, without change control?
But you mean installing authorized software cuts down on support calls to IT.
Authorized.
To install authorized software that you trust, right? And if they're working off a list of that, then from an IT support cost perspective, obviously that's a benefit, and from a security perspective, it's a benefit. Then you go to the next level, which is not only are we saying whitelisting which applications actually can run, but limiting the whitelisted applications from doing things that are considered out of bounds, right? Potentially malicious, but just out of bounds and could be misused. I like that as the next step in control, and it definitely moves the needle with respect to addressing 0 days.
We see, and without getting into a political debate on it, it's often seen that the federal government is behind on everything except cybersecurity, and that they tend to lead there. One of the things that we saw in 2015, and now leading and delivering is a whole different story, but they mandated that with the IT Modernization Act, that government agencies, federal government agencies, employ a default deny approach, a whitelisting approach on applications. And we're seeing a massive uptake in the enterprise. How far do you think we are nationally between all enterprises turning to that default approach?
Oh, I don't think that they're going to turn that way because of the government mandate. I mean, some people are driven by compliance. I think they're going to turn that way out of pure necessity. We can have a debate from an endpoint perspective. Obviously, I didn't bring this up, but part of IT hygiene obviously is keeping systems patched, right? Keeping vulnerable systems from being, or vulnerabilities from being points of avenue into your environment. It's the challenges with desktops being remote has increased the likelihood that things are going to be behind. So as necessity, we are going to have to move to where we have explicit applications that we trust being identified to run and everything else being denied. I mean, it's just, that's the only thing we can do in this environment. And it's going to go that way over time. That's what I believe. And they're going to do it out of necessity at the enterprise. The government may catch on and mandate it. And I think hasn't even some governments mandated as part of their compliance programs in like critical infrastructure that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. In the federal government included, but enforcing that mandate is a different question. Local government seem to be falling massively behind, and we've seen that over and over again with Florida cities being hit massively and paying millions of dollars last year out in Bitcoin. Texas had 23 cities that were hit, Baltimore, and the cities tend to always fall behind, but they don't tend to have the same controls that the federal government does, the local cities, in that they're often ran by one or two IT people, no one in the security department, and they sit in the same job for 20 years and stay very siloed.
Well, the federal government's had a huge, real quick, the federal government's had a huge head start. I mean, in the 90s, I was in, DOD, and we were working on systems which didn't even exist, IDS, which didn't exist for a number of years in the commercial market.
Well, and I think the reason for that head start is 10 years ago, a small business was never going to be the target of a cyber attack. It was very, very seldom. They'd get malware, and I think the worst thing I ever saw was the premium rate dialer on the modems, but and even to this day, when we speak to small businesses, we hear them say, well, no one wants my data. It's like, no, but you do, and you're willing to pay for it. And they know that. But 10 years ago, the federal government, or 20 years ago, the Soviet Union, or 30, I'm going the wrong decade. I'm not sure even the 30 years ago. They were constantly trying to, and yes, a lot of it was old school wiretaps, but it was necessity, not regulation. In that case, it was necessity that regulation was created to improve security on a physical sense, but also on a cyber sense, and that has followed through. We then saw that follow up with enterprise, more and more enterprises being attacked, the targets being banks, and now we're seeing that across the board. Nobody's safe, not even grandma with the photos at home anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that obviously more of the economy is based on, computer systems processing data. And, more of businesses and more of criminality have focused on how to attribute and monetize that data. And the skills have gone up on both sides, but probably more dramatically on the side of criminality. And so that shift forces us to change the way that we treat computer systems and cybersecurity versus security as it used to be in general. So I think, from the standpoint of, monetizing phishing and ransomware, those are things that obviously didn't exist years ago. And they have become moneymakers. And so everybody needs to take a different approach to reducing that risk.
And I think I read an article saying the ransomware market is worth $8-point-something billion, which coincidentally is the same size as the antivirus market. So and the number of employees in that market is much smaller. So it's a little bit terrifying. The other thing that's worth noting is we talk a lot about the economies. It's not just the US economy. It's the global economy. What's happening in Eastern Europe or Ukraine or Russia or North Korea affects the cyber world. It's essentially, you don't need to be on site to launch an attack. It's not like stealing someone's wallet. You can be sitting at the keyboard the other side of the world and gain access to somebody's system. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the availability of all of that is, again, needs to be addressed at the furthermost extent of the network, which is the end devices. There's a lot of assurance that can be had if you address controls of the end device over more of the traditional perimeter of the data centers and now cloud.
So then, just to jump in this part of the conversation, how do you think about security labor needs as it applies to security product purchases?
Oh man, I gotta tell you, how many times have I seen in my career where products are purchased and there's a value proposition done, and in security that's risk reduction, let's say, for the cost, where it's calculated, but no one actually factors in the operational cost, right? So everybody works hard, they do proof of concepts, then they even roll it out, and they roll it out partially, and then they run out of dollars. Or, all of a sudden it switches into operation mode, and then you don't have the IT resources to actually maintain it. And the question is, what are these tools supposed to do? I mean, we should be able to do everything from a cybersecurity perspective manually. And if we're going to augment us, we're truly going to augment it, means we're going to take some of that labor away and transfer where we're going to actually apply it to somewhere else, and have have that product automate some of our tasks, or maybe even to achieve something that was nearly impossible, which was process large amounts of data against certain rules where we don't have the teams for it. So the labor needs need to be factored into the full life cycle, and I don't think that that's done a lot of times. And we're definitely not given credit from a budgetary standpoint on true cost of ownership. So that's just belaboring the product side a little bit.
Well, so you mentioned the labor cost of this. Obviously, everything can be done, but I'm not sure which reports are accurate and which reports aren't, but I think something like 1.5 to 2 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs they claimed as of 4 months ago before COVID in the US. And I don't see my door being kicked in by cybersecurity professionals at the moment looking for jobs. So I don't think that's changed massively. Everything can be done manually. Every control can be implemented manually. But that's where product is important. It's where it's very important. I mean, and going back to 2003 or 4, when I first toyed with the idea of application whitelisting and tried to implement it and did successfully in some areas, it was a big undertaking. We had teams of people to manage that, and choosing the right products, whether it's on your application whitelisting, your zero trust, or whether it's in your endpoint security or your network management, is incredibly important if done correctly, can lower your employment costs or lower the, not cost because no one's getting let go. So,
yeah. But no, actually, whitelisting, from what I can see, it shifts the labor from security, where you have less, to IT support. It's an interesting one because when you have just detection anomalies, anything that's thrown by the antivirus or the EDR solution ends up needing to be processed by security and then actions taken. It creates the need for labor on an operations side. Application whitelisting shifts that. So what it does is it allows for the joint identification of what actually needs to be installed and run, right? And then it puts it in the hands of IT to maintain systems that are secure. And the only time security needs to interface in for that part of it is just when somebody wants a new piece of software improved. And then you can jointly review it and make sure that it's not malicious. So it actually decreases the amount of security labor, and yet is an effective control. So that's one thing that I like about it. The other is that from the standpoint of effort that we have in security, sometimes you can define things broadly, like, wouldn't it be nice and beneficial to us from a detection standpoint to see all files changed on the network by all individuals and all applications? It's a huge task, right? But if I can take that task and break it down, I think, to just like you have a unified audit and it shows file movement, right? If I can bring that back to looking at access by certain applications, certain groups, maybe if we know that the finance folks are targeted by phishing, then I've cut down on the labor task and focused it in on the areas that are most at risk, or applications accessing it that are encrypting it or modifying it or making changes. And so the idea is to be more pinpoint with respect to where we need to spend our time. And that's what I'm looking for tools to do.
Yeah, and I'm just going to bring up that audit for you there, actually, just so you can quickly see that for the audience. So, Ed, if you can see my screen there, can you? Did it share? It says it's sharing, so hopefully it's sharing. Oh, I think it's taking its time. So one of the advantages is the ability to see very granular from the endpoint perspective as well as from the server perspective. If somebody is connecting to your network and they are copying documents to USB drives, if I could, or deleting documents or accessing documents, all of that data, and in this case, I've actually got a deny policy to stop it, but all of that data is logged here, so you can very easily see in one place, rather than having to go across the board and look on a file server log and on a desktop log. You can very easily see in one place who's accessed it, where did they copy it, was it allowed, was it denied, and what actions were taken. Did they delete it or move it or hide it? And that's not just from a security point of view, which is obviously great that you can see that, but also from an IT practicality point of view, when somebody says a file is missing, and anyone who's worked in the IT department knows one of the most common support tickets is my files have gone, and normally the users drag them into another folder. So it gives you a lot of flexibility there.
Yeah, but in addition to that, there's a question that could be asked and answered, which hasn't been able to be done in the past, which is across my enterprise, for instance, where has Chrome touched files on NAS drives? We had no ability to do that before because we were looking at auditing from the server side, from the storage side, not able to actually investigate effectively the endpoint's access to the files. So I like also the ability to attribute not just to a user, but to an application. Does that make sense?
Yes. So during the last few months, there's been a lot of changes around employment as well. There's a lot of staff furloughed or made temporarily redundant. As a large enterprise, how are you dealing with that? Because essentially, upset employees or employees that had access or still have access that shouldn't be. That's a big issue. How would you approach that in the enterprise world?
Yeah, and it's not just that. Let's assume that employees, just because they're disgruntled or leaving, aren't going to necessarily turn themselves into criminals. But the accounts that were being used at a certain rate, the volume, activity, all of that should drop off, but maybe it doesn't. So it changes the way we view detection. But remember I talked about like threat actor, threat scenario target. The threat actor, which is disgruntled employee or activists, all of those things are constantly changing with respect to the probability. And so, yes, because of COVID, because of other events, those things change. And when you talk about reduction in staff, you have two sides to it. One is that you have the potential for a loss of intellectual capital. So systems that were being maintained at a certain rate aren't being maintained to that same level, or people just don't know how to keep them operationally up, which also means that maybe logging that's going to security isn't being maintained. All kinds of things can break. Then there's the use of the accounts themselves. Is everything that's associated with that account being removed properly? And everything that's not federated, are those accounts being removed? And there's a lot of people who are changing jobs and roles within a company. All of those things that we talked about and are identified with respect to, identity and access management become emphasized under this environment.
Okay. Megan, I'm not sure if you have any other questions you wanted to ask.
Yeah, actually, we do have a couple here. So the first one, when looking to augment staff with tools, how do you approach categories of tools?
Man, that's an interesting question, because categories is like something that's interesting to help sort where you want to budget, but it can be limiting when you actually try to go find something. The categories end up marking off what the features are, and the category itself defines what you should get out of it. But what happens when you want a product and the product goes between categories? It's an EDR, it's a file monitoring, it's a perimeter control. Sometimes you can get a hybrid of all these. So with respect to augmenting, a lot of times I'm looking for tools that go between what individuals on the team have from a skill set perspective and can cover multiple sides, right? It can be a control, it can help with detection, and it can reduce, tedious labor so that the team can focus on just processing events or spending time on new architecture or reviewing projects and being an interface with the IT dev folks. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask was that, I've worked on a lot of ransomware recoveries and on smaller to larger businesses, nothing in the kind of organization level scale that you've worked with. How do you approach that? The idea of a ransomware attack in an environment that's so big, and or any kind of malware or essentially self-spreading attack. How do you approach that kind of breach? And hopefully you haven't had to in the recent future, but how's your mindset dealing with if there's a breach, if there's a malware outbreak? How do we make sure that we are we've resolved the issue and that we haven't left pieces lying around inside our network.
Yeah, I mean, you got to come at it from two different angles, right? One is with a partnership with IT is, what makes it less likely? What actions can you take make it less likely that you have to, pay to decrypt and to get back into operations status, right? And so part of that is around just helping them with respect to backup strategies and, nearline versus offline and all of that. So assume that it happens and figure out how to get out of it. On the other side is, what things can you do that actually do reduce the probability that it's going to be successful, right? That the malware is going to be successful downloading, right? Phoning home, instantiating and phoning home. So, part of that egress rules, part of that is, changing the way that we authorize applications to run, right? And limiting what's not necessary. So from that standpoint, I like coming at it from both sides. Partnership with IT around recovery, and then looking for things that actually put controls and sometimes close to absolute controls in place.
Okay. Tim, I really appreciate your time today. Is there anything that you think is, from an enterprise perspective, that you want to share? I mean, we've got a lot of MSP audiences, a lot of enterprise, but from your insights of things you've learned over the years that you think is probably the most important things in security that you want to add in for the last few moments.
Yeah. I think the one thing is that the security people that you have on staff are finite. They're usually limited in numbers. If you're going to have those people actually doing tasks, they really need to do them with the full knowledge and understanding of how it reduces risk. Either reduces the probability that an event will occur or increases the probability that you'll detect it. That's, purpose-driven security. That's obviously more art than science is probably an area of greatest improvement. And if you can make a bet on an absolute control, something around that gives you a high level of assurance, then do it.
Yeah, well, and that's really it. The absolutes are the closest thing we've got to success, and the rest of it is just kind of going to help us out, hopefully, when things go wrong. So anything that's static is great, and we can't rely on users not opening things. We can reduce the risk by training them. We can't rely on the antivirus. We can reduce the risk by having one, detecting something. But anything that's absolute is always going to be very, very effective.
I mean, you brought up another good point, and that is that the whole point of security awareness and all of that is to change behavior, right? And the more that we can actually communicate why we're doing things, first we can explain it to ourselves and then explain it to others in the enterprise. Obviously, the farther we move to having everybody be part of security, not just a few members on a team.
Okay. Well, Tim, I really appreciate you joining us today, and Megan, I appreciate you hosting this. I hope that everyone stays safe in this challenging time, and that we manage to stay away from the claws of the evil guys and the ransomware.
Yes, thank you, Danny and Tim. That was a fantastic discussion. That is all the time that we have today. A big thanks to today's speakers, Danny Jenkins and Tim Rohrbaugh, and of course, our audience for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay, thank you.